Okay. All right. Well, all right. Greetings. Greetings again. And now we're going to have a little bit of a look. We're going to turn some pages um, in the great book of all that has become part of us in the cultural milieu in which we find ourselves. And we're going to look at a great and extremely formative figure for some of us, at the figure of Soren Kierkegaard. Now, socially speaking, in the great social uh, world of ideas, we might have heard of, we might associate that name, Soren Kierkegaard, with, with existentialism. He's considered to be a proto-existentialist, and it seems that our cultural history, has come down to us in the form of schools of thought with names like existentialism or impressionism, in art and in literature and modernism and symbolism, romanticism, classicism, all of these isms. But as for existentialism, we can just welcome that word into our consciousness, because I think also for some of us, that word itself is a book unto itself, with its own pages that keep on turning. So I am inclined, actually, to. It's beginning to become clearer to me now, also, like a bushel basket taken off of the ground to reveal a steadily illuminating light. To see Kierkegaard in the spirit of the consciousness in which he actually expressed himself, and to see then, to see his corpus of concepts and ideas as being intimately related to a concern that I might have, a concern a concern to be concerned, a concern to be committed in an ongoing way to something that is constantly changing, as it is experienced in consciousness. And in that way, Kierkegaard becomes someone who initiates us or brings us into an awareness of the nature of language itself, through the literary art, as a constantly changing and shimmering of surfaces as well as depths, with different ways that the original energy that gave rise to the expression, that put the writing on the page, the different ways it is refracted in the act of writing and in the act of being read. And so we are continually co-creating with, such a literary contribution in this way. It is a kind of an art of inspiration. We can begin to look at some of the descriptions that people have of it other than existentialism when we consider the word edifying. For indeed, in a certain sense, Kierkegaard is a teacher, or working in the context of a teacher. And yet, in another sense, he is careful in the terms of his times not to fully title any of his works in such a way as to have them consider their author as a teacher. No, it's more like it's the author's point of view. We could also go even a step farther in the direction of inspiration and inspirational literature when we begin to understand that Kierkegaard, a good deal of his external training and his external formation, in the schools, had to do with the fields of divinity and theology. And he himself would probably say that he would not call himself a preacher exactly. And so therefore did not tend to call any of his works sermons, instead referring to them as kind of like in the form of edifying discourses. And of course the discourse is the braid or the strand, of the thought that he was expressing, in his writing, and which the reader also reads and participates in a certain kind of way, because Kierkegaard also, let's take another step farther in the inspirational direction. Kierkegaard thinks naturally, and he's a phenomenon in this way. though there are others. Perhaps it is kind of an archetypal form. It's neither common nor uncommon to find this in human consciousness, the style of thought, which could be described as dramaturgical, right, or symbolistic, or metaphorical. This seemed to be, you might say, his primary process, the forms by which thoughts occurred to him, not the way that he thought in the way thinkers think. It brings us to mind, of Rodin's statue, that fraught, kind of like tense, kind of weighty kind of thing, which he might have called, the concept of anxiety, or the concept of dread, or the sickness unto death, or all of these human predicament kind of situations, mental, emotional, and spiritual, and of course even physical, biological, as well as supernatural, even theological, that human beings can get caught in, brooding, having to brood their way out endlessly. But there's this other aspect of it all. It's not just the brooding, it's not just the thinking, but it's the thoughts that occur to consciousness, the thoughts that are there. We cannot, as voyagers on the sea of consciousness, arrive at islands that we have given birth to ourselves. It doesn't necessarily work that way, though it could at times in certain kind of like ways of looking at it. But it's actually, the islands are out there. And we find also that the waves are out there too, the waves of the sea that carry us toward these islands where we long to come to rest or not, where we long to find succor or items of trade, or simply to explore. These islands are simply there. We haven't caused them to be there by our own will, by our own volition. And yet we are intimately related to them because of our own will and our own volition. And what is exactly the relationship between these two kind of like things, the inner and the outer? Well, for Kierkegaard, it's the nature of his work to bring us closer to a kind of interior awareness of the subjects which he is bringing to our attention. An interior awareness, you see, because one of his, if you look at it in the form of existentialist, tags, you will come across, Kierkegaard saying things like, the crowd is untruth, the crowd is untruth, or truth is subjectivity, truth is subjectivity. And these are things that can be put on signs and carried through the streets, and perhaps have, at certain times in certain places. But this isn't exactly what the way that Kierkegaard is moving through the world, through our thoughts, through our consciousness. And yet at the same time, we can look at such a statement as truth is subjectivity, and we can actually not take it apart, as they say, but draw nearer to it so as to kind of get a look at it that is there for us to see, like an island is there for us to explore. The notion that truth is subjectivity is a teaching, you could say, a mythical concept, you could say, an idea or a thought that is there for us to draw nearer to. And because of the nature of it, conceptually, we shall come to a place where it is uniquely our own point of view, out of which we see, actually. And in that way, what we approach that is on the outside, the thought that occurs to us as we draw nearer to it, with our quality of attention, which is not exactly the same stream of thought that brought us to it. But as we draw nearer to it with our quality of attention, it begins to have a new birth in us, you see. And this is the way that ideas are actually born, from the inside out, you see. So there is a circulation between the outer and the inner in the mental life of such an individual as Kierkegaard, who then becomes, by virtue of this gift, becomes all of us, or becomes emblematic to us. Oh, no, not quite emblematic, but becomes a giver to us of ourselves, you see. In this way, we have to say, there is that in his writing that makes it a devotional style of writing, devotional being something that is pondered in the heart, and devotional in the sense of being something that one relates oneself to in the most kind of like intimately attentive way. you see, which is unique to each individual. Now, this brings us to this other aspect of Kierkegaard. Like so many thinkers that are so primordial, he's moving and having his being externally in a society, in a secular society, in a relatively modern to us now kind of society. And because of this, everything that he says is subject to being taken in so many different ways. And nevertheless, this is in the nature of language, and this is in the nature of literary expression, that the art form is to be understood as being gone from one once one has created it. And so people will take it where they will take it. And in a secular society, that means, even though it's a little bit different than our society now, because Kierkegaard society at the beginning of it all, or at the beginning of a certain notion of secular society, as I think of it, is a society where it is people have a great body of mental things that they are entitled to have opinions on. And this is not something that human consciousness is all that used to. More so back then, but still true now, to have like a field of containers of mental energy, which is what you could think of, as ideas, as it was one possible kind of like conceptualization of what is an idea, containers of mental energy, which you can establish yourself in relation to by means of an opinion, and yet with Kierkegaard's subject matter, that kind of approach just really doesn't get toward it, doesn't really get at it. And yet he is coming from a world of opinion because and here's another side of him that we have to mention, as a stylist, he is speaking to the people in a language that is familiar to them as teachers and practitioners of the literary arts have, to one degree or another, always kind of been challenged to do. And so because of this, all of the forms of discourse that are out there in the, society, the secular society contemporaneous with where Kierkegaard was practicing his art, all of it becomes like kind of available to him stylistically. So he's a funny fellow, irony aside, indirection, parable, symbol, though parable, when we bring in that word, we're bringing in more than a literary genre associated with the secular world, are we not? Because parable, alongside of the word kind of means, alongside of, it's an analogical form of communication where you speak of spiritual things in terms of the things of the world, so to speak. And yet this too is an art of time, because it has to hold the reader's attention in a particular way to draw the reader into a greater awareness of the reader's experience of looking at the material and reading the material and attending to the thoughts that are expressed in the literary material. And so this is what kind of like Kierkegaard is drawing on. So as you can see, it's vast, right? It's almost too much, actually, isn't it? So we can like look at it in another sense too, and just say, well, in that secular Copenhagen, where Kierkegaard was living, on one end of the city, or on one end of the street where he lived, was the theater, and on the other end was the church. And then you can look at both of these two institutions as, signposts for the two different kind of polarities, the two different poles in Kierkegaard's artistic personality. The tropes, the forms of the theater, the masquerade, the mask, the illusion, entertainment, the necessity for the play to be a play, to do everything that the play must do, and we understand this, or we have a notion of this from so much in the Shakespearean world of philosophy, the Shakespearean philosophy, where the play is the thing, you know what I mean? Where the needs of the story, where the teaching is of the needs of the story. The teaching is of the needs of the story by which the needs of the story are met. And this becomes the formal expression, right, that the literary artist is working, and we know that from the Shakespearean world. Well, Kierkegaard, we can look at a writer such as him also in those kind of like theatrical, philosophical terms. And of course, the other end, as I mentioned, is the church, The church as an institution, right, which Kierkegaard had a striking relationship to. strikingly opposite or even antagonistic, or socially speaking, dramatically, like a dramatic opposite with the church as an institution. It fueled much of the energy of what made his mind produce those thoughts, his antagonistic, prophetic denunciation of the institutional church, of institutional Christianity even. On the other side of that being the truth, that truth is subjectivity, truth is of the individual. And so the religious concerns of the individual are not necessarily those of the mass. As a matter of fact, the crowd is untruth, that other kind of like simple truism. The individual in the individual's responsibility to come to terms with some kind of like mysterious imperative laid down from the very conception of one's sense of one's own being is not to be worked out in the language and the thoughts of the mass or the crowd. And when he spoke of the mass or the crowd, he really did mean it in almost a purely quantitative sense. It wasn't like the mass. He didn't mean like the proletariat, or the the systematists of any kind, he didn't mean that. He meant a noble could be a part of the mass, as well as a king or any aristocrat, as well as, the most humble craftsperson. It was all a different thing for him. It was more like the ideas of the mass is not the ecosystem for the destiny that the individual must work out, in response to the individual's vocation, right? In Kierkegaard's case, the vocation was to be a poet amidst the use of a great variety of the secular as well as religious language, and to be like kind of on the on the crossroads of many, many forms of thinking. This too is ever so daunting. So let's look at it in a certain sense, and instead let's look at some of what Kierkegaard puts before us as an example of the poet's art. And so I'd like to look at a few parables that Kierkegaard wrote. We love the idea stylistically these days where certain literary genres have so defined, the way the custom, contemporary custom thinks of literature. To hear a word like parable as used by someone like Kierkegaard reminds us of the primordial and ever renewing kind of like energy that comes out of the way he challenges us to try to get closer to what our conception of literature really is, in existentially and aesthetically valid literature, the literature that actually moves us. And so a word like parable, you dust off some of its old associations in order to understand this. But I almost want to say also poem, because, I've come to realize that the nature of the poem is really in the relation of one word to another, one thought to another, one setting to another, yes, one genre to another. And this is hard to see in practical terms. And yet, a poem looks like a poem, right? But there's a certain sense where the poesis is happening in our own minds, even now, as we kind of bring our attention to bear on what Kierkegaard is saying. But he's entertaining because, for example, he writes, he tells us, it happened that a fire broke out backstage in a theater. The clown came out to inform the public. They thought it was just a jest and applauded. He repeated his warning. They shouted even louder. So I think the world will come to an end amid general applause from all the wits who believe that it is a joke. So this has taken its form through the universe, this very parable. The theater is on fire. The crowd, the theater goers, they can't see, they can't tell. I guess it's happening backstage. So suddenly the play is not the thing. The clown runs out to tell them of this urgent news, it's reality. But they don't know anything other than this is the clown. Oh, we laugh. This is the clown. This is we laugh when the clown comes. Oh, the theater's afire. What a jest. And then they might judge the jest, aesthetically. Oh, was the clown really funny? Well, we don't know, but he was supposed to be, right, when he told us there was a fire backstage. They couldn't understand that it was actually no fire in this parable. They couldn't understand that it was actually a real fire, I mean to say, in this parable. And but it was also something else. They thought it was a jest and they applauded. What is the sound of one hand? What is the sound of one hand? We hear the applause, but the sound of one hand, there's many ways to play around with that, right? Could it be the clown raising his hands, saying that the theater is afire, and yet the sound is soundless because the meaning is not understood. It is not heard by the crowd. Mm-hmm. And the one who knows this is the one who sees it, and I guess that's the one who reports it, the parabolist, Kierkegaard. But there's also something else I want to tell you, and that is, yes, the applause and the laughter for the clown on the stage comes from the outside, does it not? But where else can laughter come from? Remember, truth is subjectivity. And so there's another way that Kierkegaard helps us to ask ourselves this question: where does the laugh come from? What is comedy? What is the tragic comedy? What is the meaning of these two faces in the dramatic image, of the laughter and the sadness? Well, Kierkegaard writes this parable. Something wonderful. Kierkegaard is writing this now. I'm reading it to you from a book. Something wonderful has happened to me. I was caught up into the seventh heaven. There sat all the gods in assembly. By special grace, I was granted the privilege of making a wish. Wilt thou, said Mercury, the god, wilt thou, said Mercury, have youth or beauty or power or a long life or the most beautiful companion? Choose only one thing. From this chest, perhaps it's Pandora's chest. It's a chest full of all the blessings that a human being could ask for. No, it's a chest of all the wishes that a human being could ask to be fulfilled. And the gods are offering this to Kierkegaard. That's what is happening. And then as Mercury or Hermes, the the speaker of the double meanings, he says, choose, but only one thing. So there's that limit, For a moment I was at a loss. But being Kierkegaard, he took the loss, that moment of silence when he was wondering what to ask for, what to say. For a moment I was at a loss. Then I addressed myself to the gods as follows: most honorable contemporaries, I choose this one thing, that I may always have the laugh on my side. Not one of the gods said a word. On the contrary, they all began to laugh. From that I concluded that my wish was granted, and found that the gods knew how to express themselves with taste, for it would hardly have been suitable for them to have answered gravely, thy wish is granted. You see, it seems like in this parable there were two pauses when the one who was asked, the narrator of the parable, Kierkegaard, paused at a loss, and then the pause after his request was asked, let the laugh be on my side. And then it was the gods' turn to pause. And then what did the gods do? This is why they are gods. They laughed. That the laugh be on my side, Kierkegaard asked. The gods' answer was a moment of silence and then laughter. The gods laughed. And I guess by that we know that the gift was granted, you see, because the laughter of the gods was the very gift that was asked for. You see, this is So many things are in this parable. First of all, the way that it moves dramatically, in this situation. The way that one can choose to, as we have done now, who knows if other people have done this, right, to juxtapose those two stories or those two prose poems or those two parables or whatever you want to call them. The clown trying to get across to the audience that the theater is aflame, and they, seeing before them a clown, are only able to laugh and not be able to take the message seriously. And then that's one kind of laughter, isn't it? And then there's the laughter, one asks oneself, is Kierkegaard saying to have the laugh on his side? Does that mean that Kierkegaard wants to know the meaning of the laugh within him? The laugh on his side, the laugh from his side of his existential world, of his own self, of his own existence, to have the laugh, in other words, come from within. And this is what the gods are asked for. And then the gods answer in the way that they do with themselves. They laugh. And in that way, their expression is laughter. Simultaneously, it is the answer to his request. Simultaneously, it is his gift, And so what we see then is a different conception of what laughter can be, and even of what humor can be. Kind of like, And could we then be getting close, with those two things juxtaposed through the parable, Will this be a good way to kind of approach the manifold hydra-headedness of Kierkegaard's great inspirational meaning for us? It could be. As a matter of fact, maybe the best way to find out, is to spelunk a little bit, to divine a little bit into something, if I can find it, if I can find the thing that I'm looking for here. But as sometimes happens in the looking for it, it's become lost to me. Oh yes, now I remember what it is. It's the message. Angels are messengers. I don't know if Kierkegaard talks about angels so much in the same way that his fellow Scandinavian visionary Emanuel Swedenborg would. I do know that his message has to do, with what he would always want to say is lived experience rather than necessarily visionary experience. And yet, that doesn't make him a realist, our Kierkegaard. It means that when he's calling for action, when he's calling for passion, when he's calling for things like this is not to be taken the way we take those terms like action and passion now, they're more like places where one's innate sense of value is expressed, through choice, through moral choice. The moral dimension of the actions is what he would seem to be saying are the true actions. The laughter of the gods being the laughter of the gods being given to us. And so that's what he would be saying. Now, if I find this thing that I'm looking for, it would be good. Yes, thank goodness, it finally is before me. The message. Didn't Kafka, another writer of parables, didn't Kafka have a long parable, came to be called a novel, but wasn't it called The Message or something like that? Or I don't know. But anyway, Kierkegaard writes, imagine a country. A royal command is issued to all the office bearers and subjects, in short, to the whole population. A remarkable change comes over them all. They all become interpreters. The office bearers become authors. Every blessed day there comes out an interpretation more learned than the last, more acute, more elegant, more profound, more ingenious, more wonderful, more charming, and more wonderfully charming. Criticism, which ought to survey the whole, can hardly attain survey of this prodigious literature. Indeed, criticism itself has become a literature so prolix that it is impossible to attain a survey of the criticism. Everything becomes interpretation. But no one read the royal command with a view to acting in accordance with it. And it was not only that everything became interpretation, but at the same time, the point of view for determining what seriousness is was altered. At the same time, the point of view for determining what seriousness is was altered. and to be busy about interpretation became real seriousness. Suppose that the king was not a human being, for though a human king would understand well enough that they are making a fool of him by giving the affair this turn, yet as a human king he is dependent, especially when he encounters the united front of office bearers and subjects, and so would be compelled to put the best face on a bad game, to let it seem as if this were a matter of course, so that the most elegant interpreter would be rewarded by elevation to the peerage, the most acute would be knighted, etc. Suppose that this king was almighty, one therefore who is not put to embarrassment through all the office bearers, and if all the subjects play him false. What do you suppose this almighty king would think about such a thing? Surely, he would say, the fact that they do not comply with the commandment, even that I might forgive. Moreover, if they united in a petition that I might have patience with them, or perhaps relieve them entirely of this commandment which seemed to them too hard, that I could forgive them. But this I cannot forgive, that they entirely alter the point of view for determining what seriousness is. See, this is where for Kierkegaard, the consciousness, this is the seriousness, the notion of seriousness itself has been altered. The laughter comes from the outside. The laughter is sought as something desired and coming from the outside by the clown. But because of this, because of the success of the clownish conception, of laughter seeking, has become so much a part of the way mass perception is perceived and processed. Because of this, the very notion of what is real and what is not has been switched around. You see, it can be like this. So the notion of seriousness has been altered in this sphere, in this space of hermeneutics. Mercury was the one who offered Kierkegaard, Mercury the communicator, Hermes, but also there's this kind of like science of criticism or branch of criticism or art of criticism called hermeneutics, the art of interpretation. And you could say, as a social critic, he's like, criticizing that because seeing that occurs, in the society, hermeneutics and the interpretation of everything and the interpretations reflecting back on all the interpretations, so that the notion of seriousness becomes lost. It's a really familiar argument that people make in the areas of religion, of course, and literature and all the ways that it makes people and societies go crazy. This is a familiar argument, but what is it about Kierkegaard that makes it very, very original? Well, I would say it's about the way that the term seriousness or laughter or the inside or outside or subjectivity, I guess it comes back to that notion of subjectivity, the way that it turns toward the one who is perceiving and begins to demand from the reader or the auditor or the ponderer or the contemplator or the devotee, begins to evoke a response that is otherwise not accessible to the consciousness, and this begins to be like the actual message. It could be, this begins to be the comprehensive message or the serious kind of inner truth, like a demand laid upon the soul. And in this way, this is where Kierkegaard, as a speaker of religious meaning, this is where we can begin to get a better notion of what seriousness is. So if we're in need of that remedy, we can begin to learn how to take a thinker like Kierkegaard seriously by examining our notions of what seriousness is and how it turns and how it changes. Because I have to tell you also that Kierkegaard, as a religious writer, as a literary writer, but also at the crossroads, Hermes is a god of crossroads, of course, at the crossroads of so many forms of thought, and with this kind of like aspect of his thought, which is kind of like a fomenting, kind of like a bubbling spring, there comes this kind of way we can come to understand it is like this. It's like a synthesis, of the religious and the spiritual, of what is by what I mean when I say the religious and the spiritual, I'm just talking about, I think I'm just talking about forms of language, forms of discourse and forms of poetic thought, religious and spiritual. But we can also look at religious as meaning and being standardized or conventional ways, re- religion as defined in secular terms is religion, a feature in society, you might say. But religion in Kierkegaard's inspiration is more closer to its original root, meaning, like to yoke together, to join together, to connect two different realities, two different dimensions of perception in the mode of time, in the form of time, in some kind of like discernible form of time, within the individual. And it is this bearing or attitude or sense of intellectual decorum that he begins to read the sacred scripture, and that he begins to understand the sacred and begins to give his message to us. And the way that it continues as it does, because truth is subjectivity. You could also say truth is becoming. Truth is always changing. Our conception of truth is always changing, and yet truth itself doesn't change. And yet our conception of it to be true to itself is always changing. And we have to be attentive to that as it turns and changes, you see. I would offer kind of like a parabolic statement of my own, maybe to understand maybe a certain aspect of this. Imagine, an old shepherd on a hillside somewhere. And imagine it's desert ground, and the ground is broken up, and there's many traps and crevices and indentations and divots and unevennesses in the rocky landscape. And there's serious cliffs and things as well. But imagine the shepherd's sheep are scattered out over a vast landscape covered with all of these cracks, this cracked ground. Imagine the shepherd with one voice, with one song, with one ululation, familiar to the sheep somehow, calling them home, to feed, to the fold. And imagine the sheep coming through, negotiating their own way, on their own steps, over the broken ground, and finding their own way yet in accordance with the one voice, from the one shepherd. You see, this is kind of a parable to what that relates itself to, I think, what the way that Kierkegaard is relating his own poetic thought to us, because it's best understood in this way. Truth is in a process of becoming, so religious truths are most suited to being put in elemental narrative forms, such as parables and things, because it is to be understood and is to be given in a form that reflects the fact of its constant changingness. And that's just only from the side of the speaker. What about from the side of the listener? Well, isn't it also true that the listener is approaching it through broken ground, the subject matter, and taking it in constantly? And of course, the message is always changing as one comes to become aware of it. And because one becomes more and more aware of it, one's awareness of the message constantly changes, even as the message itself, in a state of becoming, constantly changes. This is from the human side of it, you might say. And yet from the divine side of it, from the nature of it, in its actual sense, in its form, there is that which the spirit and the soul must understand. It in itself is changeless. And so another of Kierkegaard's basic, kind of most generalized, conceptions is that as near as our inner choice, and our inner resolve and our inner valuing and our inner thought processes and our expressions of those thought processes, as near as they are and as warm as they are devotionally, there always remains this unbridgeable chasm between the being of the God and the human reality of the individual living in time. And out of this comes that sense of unease, or the concept, of anxiety and dread and all of these things. There's this chasm then between the consciousness and the object of its interest in the divine sense of things. And at the same time, there is an unbridgeable chasm between the being of the individual and the being of the mass, of the crowd, of the society, which seems to have dominion of all the forms and the genres. The people need that language that is common to them and familiar to them, and yet it is limited by being a language that is only shared in the context of like crowd thought and crowd valuing. But the individual it's just a different dimension of understanding of consciousness. And well, it is literature such as Kierkegaard creates for us that helps us to come to grips with this, as is our task, you know, for those of us who feel it is our task. You know. And so he's a friend to all of us in that sense. So then, you know, we have to think of this notion of purity of heart. Is that purity of heart? This is also true, you know. If we speak of ultimate things in terms of like love and intelligence, you know, love and intelligence, justice and compassion, you know, look at the polarities in these ways, you know, justice and compassion, love and intelligence. If we look at these things, you know, and then if we, you know, borrow something from a talk some time back about Ibn Arabi, you know, the notion of the heart as being this container of the changing, this changing container of the changing, and yet in its real essence, the qalb I'm talking about, in its real essence, the qalb, you know, is purely itself as this container of changeless change, and the way that the soul kind of comes to understand it. And so there is this correlation between that, the qalb in Ibn Arabi, and purity of heart in Kierkegaard. Purity of heart is to will one thing. This is another of his teachings, which can be put in that kind of formulation. Purity of heart is to will one thing. Truth is subjectivity. The crowd is untruth. See, some of the terms, you know, the one sentence generalizations, right? We can kind of look at them, and then we can see, you know, how they actually ring true for us now, at this moment, you know, in this discourse. It could be this way, but there's also this other notion. Oh yeah, so love, intelligence, purity of heart. Purity of heart is to will one thing, and the purity of heart is such that it's like the mirror in consciousness. The mirror in consciousness. Every religion has the metaphor somehow, you know, the mirror in consciousness, where mirror of consciousness, where it reflects simply what is there. You know, it could be like a model of purification. If consciousness is so pure, if the heart is so pure that it becomes a pure mirror, you know, reflecting that which is there to be reflected, you know, is this not a desirable and profound state? You know, purity of heart is to will one thing. Well, this can also be looked at in terms of artistic and literary expressions as well. And most importantly, there's the kind of artistic and literary expression which belongs to the world of the ecclesiastical world, you know, like the icon painters. The Orthodox icon painters are anonymous individuals. The builders of the temples, the builders of the cathedrals are anonymous individuals. You talk about a sense of intelligence that is transmitted from age to age over time. Imagine, you know, yourself looking up, you know, and seeing the cornice of a building or any kind of like humble architectural structure in wood that you know was worked by a trained hand. Sometimes, if the curtain of time, you know, drifts away for just a moment, you can see the intelligence of the hand that carved, you know, that lintel or that doorpost sometimes, and it just comes across to you. But it doesn't come across to you in a way that anything kind of like a public pronunciation, it doesn't come across to you that way. These forms of messages, these forms of communication are not what we consider as public pronunciations. And so from this kind of like element, this is where Kierkegaard kind of draws some of his thematic subject matter from this kind of element. But there's also that. So the kind of art that is there to contain, you know, the Holy of Holies. I just want to belabor that a little bit more. Imagine the worker in cloth, you know, who weaves, you know, the the robes of the priest, or who weaves the cloth upon which the chalice is to be set. And this is a bit of a paraphrase from a parable that Kierkegaard wrote, and I gave up looking for it a time or two. That was why I was fumbling with the pages a few moments ago. But the gist of it is this. That worker in cloth who makes that in such a way, with every flower as inspired in thread, put there by a skilled embroidering hand, every bit as inspired as the lily of the field, or the snapdragon on the hillside, or the rose in the garden by which the nightingale sings. Every flower in that tapestried design, every star in that tapestried design is as inspired in an artistic sense as the star in the sky, which shines, no matter how feebly, how humbly, or how specifically, its own light upon the earth in the dark night, in the otherwise dark night, the shining of the star, striking a certain spot of ground upon this earth in a certain way, is reflected in every star in this tapestry. And yet, it is there only as something upon which the chalice can be laid, the actual gift of the god. It is not there to draw attention in and of itself in the way that any other form of art would be there to be. And so Kierkegaard draws our attention to this form of perception, so that as a way to edify us, as a way to our consciousness, to help us to understand the issues at hand. And now here's the parable about that which puts the being of God beyond the reach in and of itself, beyond the grasp of human consciousness. Kierkegaard writes, imagine a wayfarer. He has been brought to a standstill at the foot of a mountain, tremendous, impassable. It is this mountain. No, it is not his destiny to cross it. But he has set his eye and his heart upon the crossing, for his wishes, his longings, his desires, his very soul, which has an easier mode of conveyance, are already on the other side. It only remains for him to follow. You see, Kierkegaard is saying to us, to go back a little bit, his wishes, his longings, his desires, his very soul, which has an easier mode of conveyance, right? As Shakespeare wrote something to the effect of, if the mere semblance of my substance were thought, then injurious distance could not stop me from going through a mountain. Well, already this individual's desires and longings are already in another place. They are already actually on the other side of the mountain, it seems to say. It only remains for him to follow. Alas, this is the human condition. He cannot follow. He's a person there. Imagine him coming to be 70 years old, but the mountain still stands there unchanged, impassable. Let him become twice 70 years, but the mountain stands there unalterably blocking his way, unchanged, impassable. Under all this, he undergoes changes, perhaps. He dies away from his longings, his wishes, his desires. He now scarcely recognizes himself. And so a new generation finds him, altered, sitting at the foot of the mountain, which still stands there unchanged, impassable. Suppose it to have happened 1,000 years ago. The altered wayfarer is long since dead, and only a legend keeps his memory alive. It is the only thing that remains, aye, and also the mountain, unchanged, impassable. And now think of him who is eternally unchangeable, for whom 1,000 years are but as one day. Even this is too much to say. They are for him as an instant, as if they did not even exist. Anyone not eternally sure of himself could not keep so still, but would rise in his strength. Only one who is eternally immutable can be in this manner so still. He gives us time, and he can afford to give us time, since he has eternity and is eternally unchanging. And so there's the human drama in a certain kind of context. But it's a moment in perception that this is. If I could find it for you, I would look for it. But rather than look for it, let me just give you the gist of it so that you can go prospecting and spelunking in Kierkegaard yourself. I recommend it. It is broken ground. It is creviced ground, like all styles that reflect this actual time and space world that we live in. And yet, because of that very unevenness, there are these chasms and there are these strata that open up, and there are these spiritually, geologically speaking, formations that are there, crystals and things that are exposed, and that are there, not necessarily to be gathered by the hand, but there to be understood and to be appreciated. But anyway, I just wanted, so there is an illustration that he gives drawn from the theater, right? We've gone churchward a bit, perhaps. Well, let us now go theaterward for a bit, perhaps, just to see, how it can be. And let us go to, he describes a certain pantomime show in Copenhagen where there's two mimes, and they seem to be like involved in this, conversation, and it's very, dramatic with lots of great, mime, gestures. And though what happens is it's part of the act, I think, if I'm recollecting it correctly, and if I'm not recollecting it correctly, then it is a new parable, you might say, because this is also something that is in a process of becoming. And Kierkegaard is very much a part of the oral tradition also, believe it or not, for so many reasons. But the notion of the parable itself is meant to be existing on the broken ground of social perception and existing in, the unanticipated transformations that the moment demands of the speaker or the literary expressor. And the parable is uniquely suited to rolling and breaking and coming apart and coming together again, over all of the seeming vicissitudes of as it goes from mouth to ear and heart and mind, from among individuals and multitudes of individuals, within individuals where the trajectories are even more vast. This is the nature of the parable to work in this way. Anyway, but this is pretty funny, if nothing else is. These two mimes, in Copenhagen, this is their act, they're doing this gesticulations and these wild gesticulations, then all of a sudden they freeze, and both of their moments, it's a moment that is captured. Nowadays, we've got photography, when we've got ideologies are actually ideologies as they're publicly expressed in the popular language of the media are frozen positions that are taken from constantly changing processions of positions, and just it's taken and frozen in time, and then it's expressed as an ideology. And this is the understanding of the crowd, of course. But you and I know in our heart of hearts, of course, that this is only a certain interpretation of reality, sometimes even moral reality. And as such, it is something that one must be able to turn away from in order to hearken to a different understanding, which is of things holistically as they become in time, you see. Anyway, it's funny, though, and it works. It's the kind of laughter that is truly, inspired laughter, truly decorous expression of humor, when the mimes freeze, and just for that moment, the ephemerality of their gesturing, becomes like frozen in time and pointed out. The essential unreality becomes illustrated in this completely new kind of dimension of expression, and the surprise gives the audience kind of an aesthetic moment, and gives our teacher Kierkegaard a lesson for us as he uses that or portrays that to show the nature of the way that certain expressions, come to work by arresting the flowing of these other expressions that are in time and space terms actually so whole in themselves as to be inscrutable to that kind of like isolating kind of eye that points things out and just puts them into time in a certain sense. You see, this is how that can be. But now, so now we're coming around to the point where I have to say, when we speak of love intelligence and all of these things, And we speak also of a certain kind of spirit of truth, or a kind of spirit of inspiration, which has can be described to us in the religious language as well as in the poetic language, but which we know in our actual being, the real sense of it is only living in our own creative conception that arises out of us, maybe only for ourselves and in ourselves. But this is where actually the gods have their being, and you know, like the inspiring spirit, you know, has its being in that certain sense. So let me just say about that then, how that relates to the arts. So that we can, if we need to, we can dodge the arrow of criticism, which would, you know, claim to say that these are things that are kind of like off limits. You know, these religious questions are actually unseemly. It's not like it's off limits unless that would be grossly authoritarian, but it's more like unseemly in certain secular terms to speak of things in such a blatantly religious way as Kierkegaard seems to. But always remember that he is actually totally at odds, you know, with the churches of his time, you know, and that's a whole other story, you know, which you don't necessarily have time to go into. But still, let's bring it back though, because Kierkegaard, you know, he's every bit as much of a poet as he is any other kind of writer, as much as he is a theologian or a prophet or a critic. When he's all of these things that are parabolist or any of these things, you see how all these things, they're just different facets of each other. And our understanding is a constantly changing kind of process of all of these things. Kierkegaard puts us into this world. How can we make it so that we can find our own orientation and our own feet in it? We can by understanding, you know, the timelessness of his appeal, and we are gifted from the timelessness of his appeal, the timelessness of our own attentiveness to it, which gives us an orientation so that we can deal with all the richness and all the mercurial richness of it. So this is the work of the poet, isn't it? So here's what Kierkegaard himself says about the poet. The poet wants his material, but wanting is no art, as one says quite rightly and with much truth in the case of a host of impotent poetic wants. To want rightly, on the other hand, is a great art, or rather, it is a gift. It is what is inexplicable and mysterious about genius, just like the divining rod, to which it never occurs to want except in the presence of what it wants. Okay, now already just in that statement, we've got to look at it. I don't want to say we need to slow it down. That's not it. We need to see how it moves. You see, we're not doing anything to his thought. You know, when we come to understand it, you know, we're not like grasping his thought. You know, for thought cannot be grasped, but we are drawing near to it in our own way of understanding of it. The way to do that is opened up as a teaching by the writing. This is just the stylistics of it itself is inspiring in this way. Because see how the thought moves. It starts out, the poet wants his material. The poet wants his material. I think this is from an essay that Kierkegaard wrote about Mozart, where he said something to the effect of, if Mozart ever becomes comprehensible to me, at that very moment, Mozart will be incomprehensible to me. You know, this is kind of what he's saying. But then he goes on to talk about, you know, the poet and genius and all of this stuff. And but in the context of that, Kierkegaard also talks about notions of the classicist appreciation of art in the context of the enrapturing nature that Mozart's music has upon his singularity of appreciation. He's looking at it in the sense of opening up kind of like a classical world, but also, and this is also his dialectical mind, I have to use that word too, I've already kind of alluded to it, it's a mind that works improvisational, over broken ground, you know, calling to things in many different contexts, knowing that it will be heard and understood in many different ways. And so he's also taking this enraptured sense that Mozart gives him, he's also kind of, it becomes natural in his thought for him to turn toward a notion of of classical thought being something that is constantly rediscovered by each generation. I mean, it lives eternally in time, and yet it does not, because it comes to rebirth again and again when it is discovered by individuals, And that too is how the individual has the inspired understanding of it that unites, the form, the lover and the beloved, the art and the artwork, contemplated, and, you can express it, the emotion of it, in terms of, artistic language as well as in religious language. It's important, that, the mind, love and beauty, right? Beauty and power, power and beauty expressed in exactness of meaning, but not literal meaning, a different kind of exactness. Kierkegaard awakens us to this, you see. But anyway, look at how the thought moves. Oh, and then just that other thing that I wanted to mention about it. It's a refutation of this notion of like fortuitousness in the creation or the inception of works of art. I think that he is arguing with or refuting some notion that is out there in the contemporaneity of his secular times, of the notion that, the genius is an accident of circumstance, an accident of material, and having the material before one who has access to it just by accident, and then out of that comes the mysteriousness of this work of art, a fortuitous kind of things. But Kierkegaard seems to be saying, well, no, ask yourself a question about what reality is when it gives us something like the greatness of a work of art. We know if it was simply fortuitous, that would be like the action coming from only just one side, but it's actually the action coming from both sides. Comes again. Subjectivity is truth. Fortune is what it's all about, rather than fortuitiveness. Fortune, it comes from within the individual, to have this material before him. But there's only one Homer who sees, the material of the strife, that were the themes of his poems, or it's only one Beethoven. In love with the immortal beloved. It is only one Mozart. It is only one individual through whom comes this combination of all the different circumstances that come into play for, voila, a new thing to come under the sun, a new work of art. And Kierkegaard is reminded of that, and he puts it not quite in those terms, but he puts us in mind of it in those terms. But anyway, so that's when he says the poet wants his material. He might even be talking about Homer and the thematic material. But no, then he goes away from this notion of wanting. This is how the thought moves. Wanting is no art. Wanting is no art, especially all the many poetic arts. He kind of dismisses them, And then he says, but to want rightly is the greatest of arts. So he goes from one moment, wanting is no art, to want rightly is the greatest of arts, right? All in one sentence. And yet the sentence continues. It is a gift. It changes from an art to a gift. This is the inexplicability. This is what his sentence goes on to say. What is inexplicable and mysterious about genius. And what does genius mean? It means more like original. It means like out of its origin. This is the mysteriousness and mystery and the inexplicableness of genius. It is to want rightly. Okay, I'm with you, Soren. I see this. To want rightly is very different. I have followed your thought into this dimension. I have taken the road of your thought and come around this bend in the road, and I see this new dimension of understanding. Yes, to want rightly. And then, but there's something more to say, and this is the actual uniqueness of the insight, an insight like I don't find anywhere else. And that is, it's like the divining rod. The divining rod, my goodness, is he talking about, a rural water witch, in North Texas with a Y-shaped willow wand, right? Well, it's an ancient art, of course, but I can't help but think in those terms, in my context of time and place. The willow wand, the Y-shaped stick which is held so gently and so intuitively by the one gifted with that sense of how to find water under the ground that is not apparent to the eye. So it is like the divining rod. The divining rod is the willow wand, the divining rod to which it never occurs to want except in the presence of what it wants. Oh, so that's what to want rightly is. It is to be like the willow wand, like the divining rod. To want rightly means to want only in the presence of what is wanted. And oh, what a refined notion of desire that is, But so then what does that mean? What about all the wishes and the longings of the wayfarer who stands before the unchanging mountain? Kierkegaard writes in that moment of his perception of the thoughts, and wishes and longings of the wayfarer before the mountain. Already he's on the other side of the mountain. And yet the individual is still there before the mountain, and the mountain still doesn't change, and the individual stays there until the individual form, is vacant, hollow, and only a legend of itself. So that's a different moment of perception, because what about this other thing, this divining rod, which in the presence of what it wants, like the willow wand, when water is near or under the ground, it dips, it communicates itself, or maybe it vibrates, or any number of ways that it communicates. There are as many water diviners as there are individuals, as there are individual water diviners. Divination is as an individual process, including, of water of all different kinds, physical, biological, and otherwise. So it is that, which he is put in mind of in the art of poetry. It's the art of rightly wanting, like the art of the divining rod, which wants only in the presence of what it wants, in the presence of what it wants. So there the word is presence, That word is becoming more available to our understanding in contemporary spiritual expressions. I'm sure in Kierkegaard there's some kind of notion of how he uses that term. I want to look at it in a slightly different way, though, in just a moment, if I remember to. But as long as we're talking about language in and of itself, I also want to say that Kierkegaard gave to the Danish language itself, just like Dante, gave to Italian itself. Other people had done this. But the academic language, of course, was Latin and German in Denmark at the time. Kierkegaard lived from 1813 to 1855 in Copenhagen. He rarely left Copenhagen. I think maybe only a couple of times, maybe to that peninsula, or somewhere, and then maybe to Berlin he went. And in his milieu, it was this certain kind of stilted, idealistic criticism, which venerated, Hegel and Fichte and Schlegel and Schelling and Hans Christian Andersen too, and each of these are giants and very interesting in their own way. I mean, we who have come to Kierkegaard from our schooling, maybe learning about him as the existentialist, we can also, it is given to us to generalize about Kierkegaard as one whose impetus was as a reaction against Hegelianism and the vast, erudite idealism of the Hegelian system, whereas Kierkegaard, and he drew dramatic power from this, no doubt. He wanted to say, well, actually, philosophy has to do with the individual making the actual choices in life, and so that, that's a common kind of reaction in philosophy, between these things. But Kierkegaard is no empiricist, it's not like that. So I kind of step off of that train, sometimes, because you get caught up in these dichotomies that are just actually a little bit misleading between idealism and empiricism and all of that stuff. But I don't want to talk shop. But so how are we to understand, the crowd, and all of this, and the hold that it has, upon the individual's moral development, upon the individual's spiritual development, and in relation to the teachings and the context of religion? Well, we can look at it like, I want to just refer, for a quick moment, to the works of another prophet, of Dr. Martin Luther King, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. I am involved in my mind somehow with his sermon on the drum major instinct. And I'm not like making a statement, or anything like that about that. Instead, I'm attending to it and trying to understand. It's a very mainstream kind of social gospel kind of Christian sermon, about the drum major instinct. It's something, that's there, for us to read and contemplate. I'm not going to refer it to any more specifically than that. But it is, it's almost like a stock work. In a certain sense, sermonizing and preaching is very much an oral tradition. And kind of like the blues, one draws from a limited stock of materials and styles and subject matter also. And yet it's incredibly rich if it's practiced in an inspired way, So much so that in the figure of Martin Luther King, it comes to be, something, a phenomenon, the phenomenon of prophecy, which we usually think of in his social messages, but there's also like the drum major instinct, where he's speaking actually more to the very solid foundations of Christian integrity in individual understanding. And he was schooled, Martin Luther King was, by Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and John, and Gandhi, and Thoreau, and also people like Kierkegaard and Reinhold Niebuhr, and all these people deeply schooled in that. So when he's writing with his own inspiration about the drum major instinct, which moves us in a certain way simply because it is, coming through Martin Luther King, there's still a common stock that it is drawing on, and it's drawing on the disciples, around Jesus, and Jesus is saying, "I go where you are not going," and some of them say, "Well, we want to go where you go," and he says to them, "No, that is not how it is. That's like the unbridgeable gap or the gulf. That is not how it will be, because you have your own destiny to work out in the context of this." This being that has come to you now in this moment in time, which is so timeless, and yet at the same time, you cannot go where I go. It's a reference, it's a teaching about the nature of the grasping human ego. It wants to be like what has drawn it, but its understanding of what has drawn it is still needs to be educated by the actual, by one's own existence as an individual, by one following one's own destiny and vocation. The apostles have their destiny and their vocation, and Jesus has his destiny and vocation, and it's of a different order of being, and yet they yearn for that. But what they yearn for is their own version of that, which, is like, we can only understand it perhaps in royal terms, or in the terms of power, or in the terms of rank, or in the terms of prestige. And that's kind of what he's writing about. And so what is given instead by the God in this particular story, by Christ to his disciples, is the Spirit of truth. He makes reference to it. I will go, but I go so that there can be the Spirit of truth that is among you. You will not be able to see it or point to it, but you will know of it, by hearkening to it. And there are others also who will be, in a manner of speaking, attentive to that same kind of voice, that voice of inner truth. It's like the Holy Spirit, so to speak. So I just want to point that out, because if we want to look at some of the deeper aspects of the work of Martin Luther King, we will also come to terms, or come to nearer terms, with some of the same things that are inspiring a writer like Kierkegaard. So there is so much to look at, with our divining rod, when we begin to look into these wells, but we've got to be doing it in the right spirit, quote unquote, because the thoughts of the crowd, are so heavy and so magnetic in their way, but it only seems to be that way. One can look at it more deeply than that. And so I just want to then, kind of bring it to its this discourse, bring it to some point where I can kind of step back from it with this kind of one more little parable. And I'm going to look in the table of contents, because I've overused some of these Post-it shards or threads or scraps. And so, okay, I've got to gather my thoughts for a moment. Okay. Because this is actually, I want to offer this parable to you, because actually in it, Kierkegaard actually speaks of, in such a close way. I'm glad, that I was able to mention, the theater, the language of the theater, and the language of the church as being two ways to understand, the polarities, in Kierkegaard's thought. because it is in this particular parable that he actually brings those two worlds together in this very, very richly creative and inspiring way, giving us food for thought for the next 1,000 years, I would say, or longer. And so Kierkegaard writes, remember now, what is happening in this parable is the world of the theater, the practices of the actor, and the mysterious movement of the spirit are being illustrated in a particular and individual way, an entirely individual form of literature for your entirely individual mind. Kierkegaard writes, it is so on the stage, as you know well enough, that someone sits and prompts by whispers. He is hidden. He is the inconspicuous one. He is and wishes to be overlooked. But then there is another. He strides out prominently. He draws every eye to himself. For that reason, he has been given his name, that is, actor. He impersonates a distinct individual. In the skillful sense of this illusory art, each word becomes true when embodied in the actor, true through the actor. And yet, the actor is told what he shall say by the hidden one who sits and whispers. No one is so foolish as to regard the prompter as more important than the actor. Well, but that's just in the world of the theater, right? But now Kierkegaard looks at it in another sense. He says, now forget this light talk about art. Alas, in regard to things spiritual, the foolishness of many is this, that they, in the secular sense, look upon the speaker as an actor, and the listeners as theater-goers who are to pass judgment upon the artist. But the speaker is not the actor, not in the remotest sense. No, the speaker is the prompter. There are no mere theater-goers present, for each listener will be listening in their own hearts. The stage is eternity, and the listener, if he is the true listener, and if he is not, he is at fault, stands before God during the talk. The prompter whispers to the actor what he is to say, but the actor's repetition of it is the main concern, is the solemn charm of the art. The speaker whispers the word to the listener, but the main concern is earnestness, that the listeners by themselves, with themselves, and to themselves, in the silence before God, may speak with the help of this address. The address is not given for the speaker's sake, in order that people may praise or blame him. The listener's repetition is what is aimed at. The listener's repetition is what is aimed at. If the speaker has the responsibility for what he whispers, then the listener has an equally great responsibility not to fall short in his task. In the theater, the play is staged before an audience who are called theater-goers. But at the devotional address, God himself is present. In the most earnest sense, God is the critical theater-goer who looks on to see how the lines are spoken and how they are listened to. Hence, here the customary audience is wanting. The speaker is then the prompter, and the listener stands openly before God. The listener, if I may say so, is the actor who in all truth acts before God. So that goes everywhere, doesn't it? That goes everywhere, doesn't it? And so finally, I just want to bring up, so that's an image, actually. The true speaker is the prompter. That means the glimmering, no, it's not the glimmering, it's actually the fitful illumination in this world of time and space of actual inspiration. Well, that illustrates just so many things. Now, so I just want to leave that there for just a moment. And now this is what I want to tell you, and then it will be time, to step back for now. But what I want to tell you now is there's this other phrase we associate with Kierkegaard, which is also quite well known, and that is the leap of faith. We've all heard it before, the leap of faith, right? Well, it comes from Kierkegaard. Kierkegaard is the one who deployed this as a turn of phrase to describe a certain kind of reality. For Kierkegaard, the declarative truths, the truths of experience, the truth of empirical truth, the truths of logic, and all of these things, um, were one form of truth. But in the midst of one's own individual subjectivity, the world, despite the pressures of the crowd, the world is experienced in a kind of a different dimension where things are not as they seem, where things are and then are not, where a view of something appears and then isn't there anymore, where one seeks or desires or wants or gesticulates or communicates or experiences or senses, and yet the moment passes and things suddenly change is all. And in what way then does the conventional understanding of perception account for this? Truth is subjectivity. The individual is left bereft in this. What is true objectively for the crowd, for the individual, it is a chasm, right? It is an abyss, And from this abyss, the leap of faith is taken. And this is the leap into one's vocation or one's truth as an individual, what is true for that individual. This is the leap of faith. It is misleading, as is commonly believed, that the leap of faith means, the gamble to bet on God. That's crude. That's the crowd's formulation of it. The leap of faith is a leap into an unknown which is only realizable as it becomes in the inner life of the individual. This is the leap of faith, and that Kierkegaard is talking about. And so, as you can see, there are just so many ways, to approach the richness of such a thinker. And I have tried to approach it, in the terms that have the most meaning for me at this moment in time. And these moments of time and time itself, do what they do. But truth also does what it does, and the divining rod does what it does, and what it seeks and what it wants is there, in the places that it is there. And so this I hope to bring us all, closer to, the reality of the greatness of the poetic message of Soren Kierkegaard. And so I wish all of us, happy reading in our search, for the inner truth that Kierkegaard has for us, or any of these related subject matters. And so, on that note, and in such a moment, I offer my gratitude to you. I thank you for your heroic listening, and then I say to you in gratitude, so long for now.